Hi, this is Dr. John Bergduff. In this video, we're going to talk about measures of central tendency, but in particular, what if the data is presented in a graphical form? So suppose we have the following example. An apartment manager is tracking the number of people living in the units in her complex. The horizontal axis shows the possible number of residents in the units, and the vertical axis shows the number of units housing that many residents. Let's make sure we understand what that means. Suppose I pick one of the bars in this bar graph. The 3 on the bottom is referring to units that contain 3 residents or 3 occupants. The 7 on the vertical axis tells you how many units contain 3 occupants. So there are 7 units in this complex in which there are 3 occupants. Let's look at another one. Here, the number of occupants is 5. So we're talking about units that contain, or units where 5 occupants live. And the 2 on the vertical axis tells me that there are 2 units in this complex where there are 5 occupants. 2 units have 5 people living in them. Let me pause for a minute and ask you to think about what one of these other bars means. Give you a second to think about it, and then we'll compare notes. What does this bar tell you? If you answered that the 2 represents units that have 2 occupants in them, and 5 is the number of units that have 2 occupants in them, then you are correct. This bar is telling me that there are 5 units in this complex in which 2 people live. Let's take this data and represent it in a different way. In the top row, we're going to create a frequency distribution. In the top row, I'm going to write the number of occupants that are possible in each unit of the complex. And in the bottom, I'll write the number of units that contain that many occupants. So, for example, the first bar is referring to units that have 1 occupant in them. There are 3 units that have 1 occupant. The data is 1. The frequency is 3. The second bar is in reference to units that have 2 occupants. There are 5 such units. The third bar refers to units that have 3 occupants. And the frequency here is 7, the number of units that have that many occupants. In the next bar, the data is 4 for 4 occupants in an apartment, and the frequency is also 4. And then finally, the final column, the final bar, is referring to units that have 5 occupants, and there are 2 units that have 5 occupants. As we do our calculations, it may be useful to look at the graph. It may be useful to look at the frequency distribution. Now let's think about 4 famous methods for measuring central tendency. Let's start with mean. Another word for mean is average. So if the data represents numbers of occupants in the units, and the frequency means numbers of units, then what the mean is asking for in words is the average number of people, I'm using that word instead of occupants just because it's shorter, per unit. In order to calculate that mean, I would need to know what is the total number of all the occupants that I have, total number of all occupants, and what is the total number of all the units that I have? Let's start by looking at the total number of occupants. Or again, total people, just to save a little space. Now, there are some apartments that only have one person living in them, but there are 3 such apartments. So if I'm adding up the total number of all the occupants, I would start by saying 1 times 3. Then there are 5 units that have 2 occupants in them, so 2 times 5, 2 people in 5 units, plus 3 people in 7 units, plus 4 people in 4 units, and 5 people, and, excuse me, that's a wrong number right there. That number should be 2. 5 people in 2 units. Let's get our calculators out and figure out what that is. 1 times 3 plus 2 times 5 plus 3 times 7 plus 4 times 4 plus 5 times 2 equals 60. I'm going to create a little bit more space for myself up here. I have a total of 60 occupants, or 60 people. We want to know the mean or average number of people per unit. So now we need to think about the number of units. Now the number of occupants was found by taking the data number times the frequency, data times frequency, all the way down. The total number of units, though, we would simply add up the frequencies. So the number of units is 3 plus 5 plus 7 plus 4 plus 2. If we're going to find people per units, we will add up the numbers across the bottom row of the frequencies. And again, using my calculator, that gives me a total of 21. 60 people in 21 units gives me an average number of occupants per unit, or people per units, of 60 divided by 21, and rounded to 1 decimal place, that is approximately 2.9. The mean of all of this data is 2.9. Mean, let's talk about median next. Now, unfortunately, I have an error in all of these charts, so as we go through, every time we come to the 5 column, there are only 2 units that have 5 in them, so we will fix that. Now, the median is formed by listing all of the data from smallest to largest, or largest to smallest, and trying to figure out what the middle entry is. Quite tricky with a frequency diagram, but we're going to figure out how to do that. Now, if we go back just for half a second, you may remember that I had 21 units. That's the number of units that I'm looking at. That's the number of data entries that I have. There's a formula we learned in this section that if you want to find the middle position of a list of data, you look for position number n plus 1 over 2. In our case, that would be 21 plus 1 over 2. 21 plus 1 is 22 over 2, position 11. What that means is if we were to list all the units and how many people are in them from smallest to largest, we would be interested in the 11th data entry. Now, what does that mean exactly? So The fact, for example, that there are 3 units that have 1 occupant means if we were listing units by occupant, we would have 3 ones followed by 5 twos followed by 7 threes and so forth. In that list, we are looking for position number 11. Now I could make the whole big long list, and that would be time consuming. I think we can figure out where the 11 is by simply looking at the frequencies. We have 3 ones, so that's the first 3 positions. 5 twos, 3 plus 5 is 8, so I'm looking at 8 positions in my list of numbers. 7 more would give me 8 plus 7, 15. So by the time I list all my 3s, I will have gotten through 15 of the 21 units that I'm looking at. 11 would be somewhere between the 8th unit and the 15th unit, so it would be somewhere among the 3s. If I were to make that big long list, the middle entry, the 11th position, would be somewhere among all the repeated 3s. The median is 3. Okay? Hope that went well. Mode. Mode is the entry that occurs most often. Modes are really, really easy to see in graphical representations. Looking simply at the chart itself, notice that the most number, all of these numbers are repeated. 3 1s, 2 5s, 3 7, excuse me, let me start that again. 3 1s, 5 2s, 7 3s. Which number occurs most frequently? The 3 does. And you can see that very, very simply in the graph by simply asking which one of these bars is the highest. Whichever one is the highest is the data entry that occurs most often. That's the mode. The mode is 3. And the last measure of central tendency, which is the least used because it actually has the least significance statistically, is the mid-range. The mid-range is simply the average of the smallest data entry and the largest data entry. In this case, you'd be averaging the smallest number of occupants that you have in any unit with the largest number. The smallest number of occupants you have in any unit is 1. The largest number of occupants you have in any unit is 5. We would simply be saying 1 plus 5 over 2, averaging 1 plus 5. And that gives me a 3. So going back through, we see the mid-range of the data is 3. The mode of the data is 3. The median of the data is 3. And the mean of the data is 2.9. So I hope that example makes it a little bit easier to see how to calculate these measures of central tendency when the data is given graphically.